The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Captain Tom Wilson arrived at Atlanta International Airport. It was just another Tuesday for the veteran pilot, or at least that's what he thought. As he walked through the terminal in his crisp uniform, cabin crew members greeted him with warm smiles. They'd flown with him before and knew him as one of the most level-headed pilots on the route. The pre-flight checks went smoothly, and boarding was set to begin for the 6-hour journey to Los Angeles. Standing near the cabin door, Tom watched as passengers started filing in. Business travelers with their laptops, families juggling carry-ons, and the usual mix of tourists. Everything seemed routine until he heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots and loud voices approaching the gate. 6 men in leather jackets, covered in patches and wearing heavy silver chains, caught everyone's attention. They were members of the Road Warriors Motorcycle Club, known for their presence on the highways between Georgia and California. The smell of beer followed them as they handed their tickets to Jenny, the gate agent, who shot a concerned look at Tom. "Just great," whispered Lisa, the lead flight attendant, as she stood beside Tom. "They've been at the airport bar since 6 a.m. Her voice carried worry, but she maintained her professional smile as the group approached. The bikers made quite a scene boarding the aircraft. Their leather jackets creaked as they squeezed through the narrow aisle, bumping into seated passengers without apologizing. The biggest one, who had a thick beard with streaks of gray and a bandana tied around his head, seemed to be their leader. His jacket patch identified him as Thunder. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, parents pulled their children closer, and a few business travelers buried their faces deeper in their phones, trying to avoid eye contact. The bikers settled into the middle section of the plane, spreading across 2 rows, still talking loudly and laughing about their early morning drinking session. Tom watched all this from the cockpit doorway. After 15 years of flying commercial planes, he'd seen his share of potentially problematic passengers. But something about this group made him uneasy. He'd grown up in a small town where motorcycle clubs were common, and he knew the difference between weekend riders and serious troublemakers. These guys definitely fell into the second category. As he did his final cabin walkthrough, Tom noticed how the bikers were already ignoring basic instructions from the flight attendants. They kept their phones out, refused to adjust their seats, and one of them was trying to sneak a smoke in the bathroom, all before takeoff. "Sir, we need you to return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt," Lisa said firmly to Thunder, who was still standing in the aisle as the plane began pushing back from the gate. The big man turned slowly, towering over her. "Sure thing, sweetheart," he said with a smirk that made Tom's jaw tighten. "Anything for you." The other bikers chuckled, and a few nearby passengers visibly cringed. Back in the cockpit, as Tom began the takeoff procedures with his co-pilot Rick, he had a nagging feeling that this flight would be anything but routine. What he didn't know yet was just how right he was and how his unique background would soon be put to the test. Atlanta Tower, Flight 2317 ready for departure, Tom spoke into his headset, his voice steady and professional. But in the back of his mind, he was already running through scenarios and protocols. Not because he was afraid. Tom Wilson hadn't been truly afraid of anything since his days in combat, but because he believed in being prepared. The engines roared to life, and as the plane lifted off into the morning sky, the real trouble was just about to begin. Little did these bikers know, they had chosen exactly the wrong pilot to test. The next few hours would prove to be a story that would be told and retold in pilot lounges across the country for years to come. The first hour of the flight passed without major incident, though the tension in the cabin grew steadily. As the plane reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, the seatbelt signs dinged off, and that's when things started to get uncomfortable for everyone on board. Thunder and his crew had been passing around a water bottle that definitely didn't contain water. Lisa, the lead flight attendant, had noticed but chose to handle it tactfully rather than cause a scene. She'd dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about this group made her particularly uneasy. "Hey, darling." Thunder's voice boomed across the cabin. "When's that drink service coming? We're dying of thirst up here." His friends laughed loudly, causing a baby in the front row to start crying. The mother tried to comfort her child while shooting nervous glances toward the bikers. An elderly couple in the row ahead of the bikers asked to be moved. The wife was trembling as she explained to Bob, another flight attendant, that she couldn't handle the crude language and intimidating behavior anymore. Bob quickly found them seats near the front of the plane, but this only seemed to amuse the bikers more. "Look at that, boys. We've got the whole section to ourselves now," Thunder announced, spreading his arms across 2 seats. The other bikers took this as a signal to become even more boisterous. They started playing music through their phones without headphones, ignoring repeated requests from the flight attendants to use earbuds. Tom could hear the commotion from the cockpit. Every few minutes, the flight attendant call button would chime, usually followed by complaints about the group. He asked Rick, his co-pilot, to keep an eye on things while he made a casual walk through the cabin, supposedly checking some routine equipment. As Tom passed through first class, he noticed how the atmosphere changed the closer he got to the middle section. Business travelers who had been working on laptops were now sitting tensely, some pretending to sleep to avoid drawing attention. A young woman had draped a blanket over her head, trying to become invisible. The smell of hidden alcohol grew stronger as Tom approached the bikers' rows. Thunder was now standing in the aisle, blocking the path of a teenage boy who was trying to reach the bathroom. The kid looked terrified, especially when Thunder's friends started making jokes about paying a toll to pass. "Is there a problem here?" Tom asked calmly, his presence surprising both Thunder and his crew. They hadn't expected the pilot himself to show up. "No problem at all, Captain," Thunder replied with a mocking salute. "Just having some fun with Junior here." He stepped aside, letting the teenager hurry past. Tom noticed how Thunder's eyes narrowed, sizing him up. He'd seen that look before, the calculation of whether someone was worth challenging. What Thunder didn't realize was that Tom had spent years dealing with far more dangerous situations than this. Back in the cockpit, Tom reviewed the passenger manifest more carefully. The group had booked their tickets last minute, all paid for with the same credit card. Something about that detail nagged at him, especially combined with their behavior. The situation escalated when one of the bikers, a tall guy with a snake tattoo on his neck, started following Lisa around the cabin, making inappropriate comments every time she tried to help other passengers. The other flight attendants had begun working in pairs, no longer feeling safe moving through the cabin alone. "Captain," Lisa's voice came through on the intercom, trying to sound calm but clearly stressed. "Could you please come to the galley for a moment?" Tom knew this was serious. Lisa was one of the most experienced flight attendants in the company. If she was worried, there was good reason. As he stood up to leave the cockpit again, he caught Rick's concerned expression. "Keep an eye on the radar, Rick. I have a feeling we might need to consider our options soon." Tom's voice was steady, but his mind was already running through various scenarios. He'd handled tough situations before, both in the air and during his previous career, but something told him this one was about to test every bit of his experience. Little did the bikers know they were about to learn why messing with this particular pilot was the biggest mistake they could make at 35,000 feet. The next few minutes would change everything, not just for this flight, but for everyone involved. What the troublemaking bikers didn't know about Captain Tom Wilson would have made them think twice about their behavior. As Tom walked toward the galley to meet with Lisa, his mind drifted back to his past, a past that had perfectly prepared him for exactly this type of situation. 20 years earlier, Tom had been flying F-16s over hostile territory. He remembered the intense focus required during those missions, where split-second decisions meant the difference between success and failure. But it wasn't just his combat flying experience that mattered now, it was what came after. After his combat tours, the Air Force had selected Tom for a special assignment. He spent 5 years as the lead instructor at the Air Force's Close Quarters Management Program, teaching military personnel how to handle hostile situations in confined spaces. The most dangerous fights, he used to tell his students, are the ones in places where you can't run away. Tom had trained hundreds of service members, from fresh recruits to seasoned veterans. His specialty wasn't just teaching them how to handle physical confrontations, it was showing them how to prevent situations from getting physical in the first place. Your best weapon, he'd always say, is the ability to read people and control the situation before it explodes. During his teaching years, Tom had worked closely with air marshals and flight security teams. He knew exactly how things could go wrong in an aircraft at 35,000 feet, and more importantly, he knew all the ways to make sure they didn't. His students had nicknamed him the Quiet Storm because of his ability to calm down the most heated situations without ever raising his voice. Lisa was waiting in the galley, her usual confident demeanor slightly shaken. "Tom," she whispered, "I've been flying for 12 years, and I've never felt this uneasy about a group of passengers." She explained how the bikers had been going through their bags, pulling out items that made her suspicious. Tom nodded, understanding her concerns. He thought about Mrs. Chen, his favorite instructor from the Air Force's Advanced Psychology of Confrontation course. She had taught him how to spot the subtle signs that separate ordinary troublemakers from genuinely dangerous people. The way Thunder and his crew were acting was throwing up red flags that Tom recognized all too well. "Remember that incident in Dallas?" Tom asked Lisa quietly. She nodded. Everyone in the airline industry had heard about the mid-flight brawl that had forced an emergency landing. "I was actually there, consulting with the airline afterward. We completely rewrote their threat assessment protocols based on what happened." What Tom didn't mention was that he'd also helped develop the airline industry's current guidelines for handling group disruptions. His experiences had taught him that most troublemakers were actually looking for a way to back down without losing face. They just needed someone to show them how. As they talked, Tom could hear Thunder's voice getting louder again. This time he was bothering a flight attendant about the temperature in the cabin. "It's too hot in here, sweetheart. Maybe you should help us cool things down." His friends laughed at the obvious intimidation attempt. Tom's hand instinctively touched the left side of his chest, where under his pilot's uniform he carried a small reminder of his past. It was a simple coin given to him by his old commanding officer after a particularly challenging mission. "Keep your cool when things get hot" was engraved on one side. Those words had guided him through countless situations. The past few years of commercial flying had been relatively peaceful, but Tom had never let his guard down. Every 3 months, he still attended advanced conflict resolution workshops. He practiced meditation daily, keeping his mind sharp and his reactions controlled. "A calm mind sees solutions where others see only threats," as his old instructor used to say. Looking at Lisa's worried face, Tom knew it was time to put all his years of experience to use. The situation was reaching a tipping point, and he needed to act soon. But unlike the young hotshot pilot he'd been 20 years ago, the Tom Wilson of today knew that timing was everything. "Give me a few minutes," he told Lisa. "I need to check something in the flight manual first." What he didn't tell her was that he was actually reviewing the airline's protocol for secure cockpit procedures. If things went the way he suspected they might, he wanted to be absolutely certain about every detail of what he could and couldn't legally do. As he walked back to the cockpit, Tom could feel eyes following him. Thunder and his crew were watching, probably thinking they had intimidated another pilot into hiding in the cockpit. They had no idea that they were about to meet someone who had spent his entire life preparing for moments exactly like this one. 3 hours into the flight, the tension in the cabin had reached a boiling point. The constant sound of the plane's engines couldn't mask the growing unrest among the passengers. Thunder and his crew had been getting more restless with each passing hour, their voices getting louder, their behavior becoming more unpredictable. Tom had just finished checking the weather reports when he heard a commotion outside the cockpit. Through the door, he could hear raised voices and what sounded like someone stumbling against the cabin walls. Rick, his co-pilot, exchanged worried glances with him as they both recognized the sound of heavy boots approaching. "I gotta use the bathroom up here," Thunder's voice boomed through the door. "The ones in the back are all occupied." This was a lie. Tom had just checked the cabin monitor showing both rear bathrooms were empty. Lisa's voice came next, firm but professional. "Sir, I've already explained that this lavatory is reserved for first-class passengers. Please return to your seat." "Come on, sweetheart, make an exception for me," Thunder replied, his tone carrying an edge that made Tom's skin crawl. "My friends and I have been very patient." The next sound made Tom's heart race, the distinct noise of someone being pushed aside, followed by a small cry from Lisa. Through the cockpit door's tiny window, he could see 2 of the bikers had now joined Thunder near the front of the plane. One of them was the guy with the snake tattoo, who had been harassing Lisa earlier. A young mother in first class clutched her child closer. An elderly man tried to stand up, perhaps to help, But his wife pulled him back down, shaking her head fearfully. The tension in the cabin was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Lisa pressed the emergency button, sending a silent alert to the cockpit. It was a code they all knew well: serious situation, immediate response needed. But Tom had already started moving before the light even blinked on his panel. "Rick," Tom said calmly, "engage the autopilot and contact air traffic control. Tell them we might have a situation, but don't request emergency procedures yet." His voice was steady, showing none of the adrenaline now pumping through his system. Thunder was now rattling the bathroom door, purposely making noise. His two friends had positioned themselves in a way that blocked the view from most of the cabin. What they didn't realize was that Tom could see their reflections in the cockpit window, and he recognized the stance they were taking. They were getting ready to make their real move. "Hey, pilot!" Thunder shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe you should come out here and help sort this out." It wasn't really a request, it was a challenge. Tom reached under his seat and pulled out the flight manual, quickly reviewing one specific page he had marked earlier. He knew every airline regulation by heart, but he wanted to be absolutely certain about his next actions. Everything had to be by the book. Lisa caught his eye through the cockpit window. She gave him a subtle nod, their silent signal that she had already activated the secondary security protocols. The cabin crew had been quietly moving elderly passengers and families away from the danger zone, one at a time, making it look like routine seat changes. The air marshal on board, if there was one, hadn't shown themselves yet. Tom knew they wouldn't unless absolutely necessary. That meant handling this situation fell squarely on his shoulders. As he stood up from his seat, he could feel the weight of his experience settling around him like a familiar jacket. "Remember," he whispered to Rick, "if anything happens, follow the emergency procedures exactly as we practiced." Rick nodded, his hands steady on the controls despite the stress of the situation. Tom took one deep breath, centering himself just like he used to do before combat missions. Through the cockpit window, he could see Thunder's reflection again. The big man was grinning, probably thinking he had successfully intimidated the pilot into coming out. What Thunder didn't know was that his plan, whatever it was, had already failed. Because at that very moment, Tom wasn't just a commercial airline pilot anymore. He was everything his 20 years of military experience had made him, and he was about to show these bikers exactly why they had picked the wrong flight to cause trouble. Tom emerged from the cockpit with a calm that surprised everyone watching. His movements were unhurried, almost casual, as he closed the door behind him. The first-class passengers held their breath, expecting some kind of confrontation. Instead, Tom did something completely unexpected. He smiled. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily over the engine noise, "I hear we have a bathroom situation." He looked directly at Thunder, but not in a challenging way. His posture was relaxed, hands visible and open at his sides, a detail that wouldn't mean much to most people, but spoke volumes to anyone with security training. Thunder's grin faltered slightly. He'd been ready for fear, anger, or authority, but this easy confidence threw him off balance. His two friends exchanged uncertain glances, their tough guy stance suddenly looking more like awkward posturing. "Yeah, we got a situation all right," Thunder managed to say, trying to maintain his aggressive tone. "Your flight attendants here aren't being very accommodating." He gestured toward Lisa, who stood her ground professionally. Tom nodded thoughtfully. "You know, this reminds me of something that happened on my old Harley." He noticed Thunder's eyes narrow at the mention of motorcycles. Was running with a group down in Texas, hit some weather. Ended up stuck at this small-town diner with about 20 other riders. The mention of riding caught Thunder's attention. His stance shifted slightly, still aggressive, but now tinged with curiosity. Tom continued, his voice conversational, as if they were just sharing stories at a bar. Place had one bathroom, line was getting long. Tension was building up. You know how it gets when you've got different clubs in one spot. Tom's knowledge of biker culture was obvious, and it was having an effect. The other passengers watched in amazement as the atmosphere began to change. "What happened?" asked the biker with the snake tattoo, almost despite himself. "Well," Tom said, taking a step closer but still maintaining a non-threatening position, "the owner came out. Turned out he was an old Marine. Instead of laying down the law, he started telling stories about his own riding days. Before you knew it, everyone was sharing routes and road tales. The bathroom issue just sorted itself out. Thunder's aggressive stance had softened noticeably. Tom's story had done something remarkable. It had given the bikers a way to step back without losing face. But more than that, it had established a connection. These weren't just troublemakers to be controlled, they were riders who had lost their way. "You ride?" Thunder asked, his voice carrying a hint of respect now. "Used to. Had a Road King custom." Tom named the Harley model with the ease of someone who truly knew bikes. "Sold it when my daughter was born, but I miss it every day. The freedom of the road, you know." The tension in the cabin was dissolving, replaced by something unexpected: understanding. Other passengers watched in amazement as Tom and Thunder began discussing favorite riding routes. The other bikers joined in, their earlier aggression forgotten in the enthusiasm of sharing road stories. "Listen," Tom said after a few minutes, his voice low and confidential, "I get it. Long flights are tough, especially for guys used to being in control of their own machines. But up here," he gestured around the cabin, "we're all in this together. Like a convoy on the highway. Everyone needs to watch out for everyone else." Thunder looked around, seeing the cabin through new eyes. He noticed the young mother who'd been clutching her child, the elderly couple who'd moved seats earlier. For the first time, he seemed to realize the impact his group's behavior had had on others. "Yeah, I hear you, Captain," Thunder said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Maybe we got a little carried away." He turned to his friends. "Boys, let's head back to our seats. Use the bathrooms in the back when they're free." As the bikers moved away, other passengers visibly relaxed. Lisa gave Tom a subtle nod of appreciation. What they just witnessed wasn't just conflict resolution, it was a masterclass in understanding human nature. Back in the cockpit, Rick looked at Tom with newfound respect. "How did you know that would work?" he asked. Tom checked his instruments before responding. "People are people, no matter who they are. Sometimes they just need to be reminded of that." He smiled slightly, remembering something his old flight instructor used to say. "The best pilots don't just fly planes, they understand the people in them." The rest of the flight was continuing normally now, but something remarkable had happened. In those few minutes, Tom had shown that the most powerful way to handle a crisis wasn't through force or fear, it was through finding common ground and treating people with respect, even when they weren't showing it themselves. What happened in the next hour of the flight left every passenger with a story they would tell for years to come. The transformation in the cabin's atmosphere was nothing short of remarkable. The same bikers who had been causing fear and anxiety were now some of the most helpful passengers on board. Thunder, who had earlier been intimidating other passengers, was now helping an elderly gentleman get his heavy bag down from the overhead compartment. His friends, following his lead, had completely changed their behavior. The guy with the snake tattoo even offered his bag of chips to the young mother whose child he had scared earlier. "You know," Thunder said to Tom during a quiet moment near the galley, "I've been riding for 20 years, but I forgot something important along the way." He paused, looking out the window at the clouds below. "We started out as a group that helped people on the road, fixing broken-down bikes, helping stranded travelers. Somewhere along the line, we lost that." Tom listened, understanding the weight of the moment. He'd seen this before, tough exteriors hiding deeper truths. "It's never too late to get back to those roots," he replied quietly. The other passengers watched this transformation with a mixture of amazement and relief. A businessman who had earlier hidden behind his laptop now found himself in a fascinating conversation with two of the bikers about classic motorcycles. The elderly couple who had moved seats earlier were back in their original spots, sharing travel stories with another member of the group. Lisa, the lead flight attendant, couldn't help but smile as she watched it all unfold. "In all my years of flying," she whispered to Tom, "I've never seen anything quite like this." She had dealt with countless difficult situations, but never had she witnessed such a complete turnaround. One of the younger bikers approached Tom with a question that surprised everyone. "Captain," he said, somewhat hesitantly, "we've got this charity ride coming up next month for kids with special needs. Would you maybe want to come speak to our group? Share some of your experiences?" The request showed just how deeply Tom's approach had affected them. He hadn't just diffused a tense situation, he had reminded these men of who they could be, who they wanted to be. Other passengers began sharing their own stories. A teacher talked about her work with troubled teens, finding an unexpectedly receptive audience in the bikers. A retired mechanic shared tales of the classic bikes he used to restore, leading to an animated discussion about engine types and restoration techniques. The cabin had become what all flights should be, a community of travelers sharing a journey together. The transformation was so complete that when some light turbulence hit, it was Thunder who helped calm a nervous first-time flyer, sharing his own story of getting over his fear of flying. "You see that wing out there?" he explained to the nervous passenger, repeating what Tom had told him earlier. "It's designed to flex like that, just like how a bike's suspension handles bumps on the road." The comparison seemed to help, and soon the nervous passenger was relaxing. Even the small things had changed. The bikers now said "please" and "thank you" to the flight attendants. They kept their voices down during announcements. When they needed to get up, they did so carefully, mindful of other passengers' space. Tom watched all this from the cockpit doorway during his routine cabin check. He thought about all the different ways this situation could have gone. The old approach, confrontation, threats, force, would have only made things worse. Instead, by finding common ground and appealing to their better nature, he had not just solved a problem, he had helped create a moment of genuine human connection. As the plane continued its journey westward, the story of what happened was already spreading through the cabin. Passengers were texting family members about their experience, taking subtle photos of the now peaceful scene. But the real story wasn't just about how a potential crisis was avoided, it was about how understanding and respect could bridge any gap, even at 35,000 feet. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, there was a buzz of activity throughout the cabin. Word had gotten out that FBI agents were waiting at the gate, standard procedure when there's been a mid-flight disturbance. But what happened next surprised everyone, including the law enforcement officers who were expecting to deal with troublemakers. Thunder and his crew were the last to leave the plane, but not because they were being detained. Instead, they had stayed behind to help other passengers get their bags down and make sure nothing was left behind. The transformation in their behavior wasn't just an act, it was genuine change. "Captain," Thunder said as he prepared to leave, "I owe you an apology." "No, I owe everyone an apology." His voice was gruff but sincere. He turned to address the flight crew and remaining passengers. "What we did earlier, that's not who we're supposed to be. Sometimes you need someone to remind you of that." The FBI agents were confused when they boarded the plane, expecting to find a hostile situation. Instead, they found passengers exchanging phone numbers with the bikers, sharing contact information for the upcoming charity ride, and telling stories about the most unusual flight they'd ever experienced. Lisa stepped forward to speak with the lead agent. "There was a situation," she explained, "but Captain Tom handled it in a way I've never seen before." She described how the potential crisis had turned into something entirely different, a lesson in understanding and respect. The young mother from first class approached Thunder before he left. "Thank you," she said softly, "for showing my son that people can change." Her little boy waved goodbye to the bikers, no longer afraid of their tough appearance. The airline's security team arrived to take statements, but they found themselves documenting something unprecedented. Instead of filing complaints, passengers were praising how the situation was handled. Several even wrote commendation letters for Tom right there in the terminal. One older passenger, a retired teacher, put it best. "I've never seen anything like it. That pilot didn't just prevent trouble, he showed everyone on that plane that there's always a better way to handle things." The story spread quickly through the airline industry. In crew lounges across the country, pilots and flight attendants shared the tale of how one captain had turned a group of troublemakers into allies without raising his voice or making threats. It became a case study in the airline's training program, teaching new crew members that the best solution isn't always the most obvious one. A week later, Tom received a surprise at his home airport. Thunder and his entire group had shown up for his departure flight, not to cause trouble, but to show him something. They proudly displayed their motorcycle club's new motto, "Respect the road, respect each other." They had redesigned their club patches to include these words. "Your story changed more than just that flight," Thunder explained. We went back to our club and shared what happened. It made us remember why we started writing together in the first place, to help people, not to scare them. The airline's corporate office took notice too. They invited Tom to help develop a new training program for handling difficult situations. His approach, finding common ground, showing respect, and appealing to people's better nature, became part of the standard curriculum for flight crews worldwide. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome came 3 months later. Thunder's Motorcycle Club hosted their charity ride for children with special needs. The event had a surprise guest speaker, Captain Tom, who arrived to find that several passengers from that memorable flight had also come to show their support. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, Tom told the gathered crowd. What matters isn't how a story starts, but how people choose to change it. The local news covered the charity event, and when they interviewed Thunder about the flight that changed everything, he said something that summed it all up perfectly. We thought we were tough guys causing trouble on a plane. Instead, we met someone who showed us what real strength looks like, the strength to see the good in people, even when they're not showing it themselves. As Tom flew his next routes, he kept a photo in his cockpit, one taken at the charity ride, showing him surrounded by smiling bikers and families. It served as a reminder that in life, just like in flying, the smoothest path through turbulence isn't always about power or control. Sometimes it's about understanding, respect, and giving people a chance to be their better selves.